I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Martin Ciupa, a subject matter expert on artificial intelligence. Martin is the CEO of Remoscope, an AI-based telehealth startup, and an advisor and consultant to Mindmaze, a Unicorn Neurotech company focusing on applying advanced neuroscience in everyday life. Martin has decades of experience in computing and artificial intelligence, PhD studies in AI, and a master's degree in cybernetics. So Martin, welcome back. Now, let me start with a statement from The Guardian. Great Britain and the United States have both started funding research into aerial drones that decide who they kill. And of the 36 countries currently using armed drones, analyst Paul Scharre recently said, it's very likely that nations will invest in autonomous technology, if nothing else, out of fear that their adversaries are doing so. So today, I am honored that you could join me once again. And our discussion topic, I guess, is the ghost in the machine for artificial intelligence. But, by that, really what I mean are human flaws, bias, and perceptions. And you, sir, are as an AI expert, you are the person to speak about this. So thank you.
Thank you, Deed, and for your, how can I say, very positive introduction of me. I'm sure there are many, many people who also can provide input like this, but I'm very happy to carry this conversation forward with you.
Yeah, well, as we mentioned, before I started recording, as we mentioned earlier, I recently did an interview on this, and during the research for that, the decision to create autonomous armed drones, not just drones. I mean, there are tanks, there are robot platforms being developed. I can go into those later, but that decision has already been made. It's already moving forward. And it seems like the discussion of the ethics, and I guess not just that, but what we bring into this of ourselves hasn't really been explored yet, right? It's been very narrow and linear. We can save cost and we can save lives by letting these machines do the jobs themselves. That makes sense. The challenge is, what are we not looking at now that may haunt us later, I guess?
Yes, it's a very interesting area. There has been attempts at United Nations for a campaign against killer robots or autonomous weapons, and that got a listening to, but tends to be the case that when threats to nations in terms of the military position against potential adversaries, that some of those concerns are minimized. So the general position for the use of drones and autonomous weapons has been fairly well established and has been, as I say, discussed philosophically. The real issue is when we take the decision to equip those systems with the ability to make their own decisions in real time and not go back to humans in the loop to make that decision to kill. I think this is a very good movie from a few years ago called The Eye in the Sky, and that really plays out some of these issues. Because the problem is that I think it was Clausewitz would say, in terms of his concept of the fog of war, is can you really use AI to evaluate the ethics of a signature decision to fire or not fire? And does that have the capacity to take in the potential for collateral damage, for misidentified targets? And basically, how do we make the decision about who is responsible? Are we saying the machine is responsible? I think it would be hard to say that. There's no implication that it's conscious. There's no implication that it had its own intentionality. It would be of either the military and the decisions to use those machines, or potentially the designers, the manufacturers. So is it the manufacturer or is it the government? I mean, the same can be said about autonomous vehicles. If they have accidents, if they cause accidents on the road, is it the government's responsibility or is it the manufacturer's responsibility? So these issues are very real, not just in the military.
You know, and if I could interject for a second, I mean, one immediate issue, I guess, that comes to mind, and this would go back to kind of the Google Lambda example from earlier, is in terms of the government, that, you know, especially when they're doing kind of like I don't know what you call it, a post-mortem analysis, right? One of the questions would be, how did this machine make that decision? And if you're getting into AI and neural nets, those weights and balances, it seems like that would make it almost impossible to unravel how the machine actually decided on that particular signature.
Yes, I mean, it would depend upon the kind of technology and the architecture of the decision making. If it was purely a neural network, so you take signal in and you get decision to fire to these particular coordinates. If that is purely a neural network, then you're deep into the problem of explicable AI and black box concerns. Can you explain the decision in those circumstances? If, however, the neural network aspect is in a more of a neurosymbolic architecture, where you have a signature analysis, which gives this is a legitimate target, and that is the neural network. So it's object identification within the scope of a trained classification of a legitimate target. And then that pops up into a rule-based filter, which says, does this meet all of my requirements, which I have because of a variety of perhaps regulations or at least ethical justification by the manufacturers or the government. I mean, is this something that would be like subject to FDA? I know it's not the right domain, it's not medical, but you know, would you set up a appropriate body, a government body, to say, look, we are only going to use these weapons within this regulated structure? So I would see that decision to be filtered. Do I meet all of my requirements? Have I got a go green light? Have I identified with sufficient confidence the signature? Are the circumstances sufficiently compelling? You know, a variety of filters, which may well be symbolic, and therefore you could argue these are the rules. All the neural network is doing is saying, here's a candidate signature.
Well, and so this starts, it seems like this starts to take us to the ghost in the machine topic. And this is the one I know you were super excited about this. I'm super excited about this. This is the implicit human bias, right? And again, I think this is a very big issue. It's not just aerial drones targeting. It's when we're creating artificial intelligence, how much of ourselves and what of ourselves should we put into this? And again, I think this is going to be a giant issue in the 21st century. You know, I think you had talked about the beast nature versus, you know, I guess the more enlightened mind, right? And are we accidentally putting that beast nature into AI when we create it? You know, are we putting that warlike, tribal, biased nature into these things? And are we doing it on accident?
It certainly is an issue. And it's one that is becoming more and more obvious to the AI ethicists on the boards of many of the large companies. Unfortunately, some of these large companies feel sometimes that they're surplus to necessity, especially if they start to criticize the actions of those companies. They tend to get short shrift. So they get employed to give like a green light, this is ethical. But if they bring up ethical concerns that hit the bottom line, well, maybe that input sometimes is qualified as unnecessary. I think that will change. I hope it will change, because criticism is a necessary thing to stop yourself from doing mistakes, whether that's internal, a critic in your mind, or whether it's employing people that you respect for their input to help save the company from severe criticism. So certainly the bias in, bias out problem of current AI datasets, being presented with datasets through the history of mankind's or humankind's past experience. And one issue, example I should say, of that is how we did predictive policing, or attempted to do predictive policing, so that we would look at where crimes mostly occurred under given circumstances. And there was plenty of data on police reports to be able to provide a basis for some predictive analytics. It's an early form of AI. And you can use neural networks, unsupervised neural networks, to dig into that big data and to come out with recommendations. You should send a police car here at this time because you may prevent a crime. Fine, and actually it might work, and nothing proves it would work. But a lot of that tends to be based upon the bias of policing in history, so that you have people looking at ethnic bias. And so people will, the system will be embedded with moving vehicles and policemen into situations where the assumption is crimes will occur based upon ethnicity. And this starts to embed racism, Black Lives Matter concepts into the data sets.
And that becomes a feedback loop, right? That was one of the takeaways that I had from BLM. And I'm not sure if it was obviously stated, but it was, when you focus the police on a specific group of people, psychologically, there's an impact, right? And that's not to say that that's the only, the only effect or the only factor that matters, but there's an impact in that creates kind of a feedback loop where the police are focused on them, they are more concerned about the police, and it creates this adversarial relationship that makes everything more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we needn't go into in this forum about all of the issues and the rights and wrongs, but all we have to say is, if there was bias in the data, then there is going to be bias in the output of an autonomous AI system. So if you think there is no bias, then you have no problem. But there are many people that think there is. I mean, I remember I gave a presentation at a robotics conference about 4 years ago, and the issue of robotic risk came up. It was related to AI, but it was in this context. In one of the big Marriott hotels, they installed taps with a light-sensitive meter. So when you put your hands under the tap, the water would flow. So you didn't need to touch the tap for hygienic purposes or whatever. Anyway, it seemed like a good idea, and it worked, unless you had darker skin, and then it didn't work because they didn't test it.
Oh, okay.
So it's just not thinking. It's not having the imagination. We were talked about conceptualizing risks in AI earlier, and this is another. It's a failure of imagination. To think in terms of outside of your personal experience. And which is why in AI we need more diversity. We need diversity across the spectrum of human behavior and backgrounds, so that there is some degree of opportunity, at very least, to correct the blind input of bias into our data sets. Does that make sense, Tim?
It does. It does. And, you know, I think one of the things, again, that makes this so important, I'm just looking at your notes here. So one of the things that you'd written down was Isaac Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics. And I don't have those memorized offhand, but I have read them many, many times, as I'm sure probably most of the people in our audience have. The thing that gets me about that is, you know, here we are. I mean, I think we're probably about 70 years after he wrote those. And he came up with that set, you know, as, okay, this will help protect us, right? These are the laws that will help protect us from our creations. And it seems like we've pretty much just thrown those to the wind for the most part, you know? I mean, if we have drones deciding who to kill, those 3 laws, if I remember right, they were structured in terms of, okay, put human life first, and then, you know, if there's a question, put human life first, and we've thrown that out the window. So what do we have a guiding principle, and if we're getting rid of that cornerstone, I guess?
All right, so we're talking about ethics here, and there are 3 schools of ethics which we should recognize in AI. There's the school of ethics, which is basically utilitarian ethics. Okay, so you have a function, and you're looking to satisfy the minimizing that function, where you're saying, you know, do the least damage to the group of people that you're managing. Now, the problem about that is damage and relative damage, and you get things like the trolley problem to try to analyze the utility functions to come up with a score. So, for example, in the movie I, Robot, at the very early stages, you get the protagonist who is drowning, and and there's a party that he would like to save who is also drowning, a little girl. And he's angry with the robot for saving him and not the little girl, because the robot had made a utility analysis that the little girl had a very low likelihood of being saved, whereas the protagonist had a high likelihood of being saved. And so he made a utility judgment. Now, these utility judgments are based upon values, and the values that you may choose to import into that utility function are not the same necessarily in other cultures. In other cultures, there is very high respect for elderly people, in others for young people, in others for people with, how can I say, a large education and contribution to society against people who are perhaps don't have those benefits. So you can see how assigning value is a problem. So that's one, utility ethics. 2, it's like deontological ethics of Kant and others, which is the duty. What duty do you have? And he comes up with the maxim of do that which you would wish to be a universal law. So the categorical imperative and things like this, which is interesting. And you have, in addition to deontological ethics and utility ethics, you have value ethics, which goes back to Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, about that we should do things which are brave and true and good. Now, all of these things are words, concepts, and in themselves, I see meaning and value to them. But if you want to apply them in an AI, just how you go about doing that is a tremendous problem. You may get a result from a utility ethics calculation, which is different from a deontological calculation. So it's very, very difficult to do that. Now, so that's one point. Coming back to Isaac Asimov, we say 3 laws, it's actually 4. You know that, right? Or did you know?
Okay, what's the 4th? What's the 4th? It's been a long time.
Yeah, well, it's the 0th, or the 0 law.
Oh, that's right.
I invite your listeners to look it up. And basically, it's talking about not putting a risk to mankind as opposed to the individual. Now, you might say, well, that's logical, because if you wish to put humankind as a higher order ethic than an individual human, it's kind of a utility concept. You can get your head around it. But who do you include in humankind? Is it your country, or is it all humankind? So would you mean you wouldn't go to war if, as an autonomous weapon, if you thought there would be more death to humankind, even if there is, in other words, support your adversary, because that would minimize the impact on humankind. So you get these things coming out of heuristic laws, which again is this failure of imagination. So how do you do that? Well, you can have laws, which is more deontological, and you can have cases where you give data sets and say, label this as a just war, and this is an unjustified war, and there's a philosophy of just war.
Well, and again, those are incredibly human biases that we're putting into it, right? So,
right. I mean, you can get an ethics panel to try to say, look, we give you this founding set of ethics, and let's give you 1 million test cases. And this ethics panel, which has been sitting for 30 years, has tried its best to label this decision as is right and these decisions are wrong. And you try to make it such that the black box, the neural network, gets it right as far as the ethics panel is concerned. But what about those extreme corners of the envelope where the panel didn't do? Well, the system could give its judgment, and it might be right, or it might be wrong. So I think there will always be a circumstance where you have to say there is a safe zone for the system to operate because this has been checked and tuned to the ethics panel. But outside of this, unless the decision factor is very clear, it should default to a safe zone, what do we call it in military terms? I forget for the time being. But the point is, it would perhaps then call out to an ethics panel 24/7. And though it may not be timely, and if time was a factor, it might be given the permission to act. But then it would be that would be reflected over by the panel, and perhaps a change made to the system overall.
Now, Martin, it's interesting. A few moments ago, I wanted to redirect back to this. You mentioned the utility decision, right? And for my robot at the beginning of the movie. And that was a powerful, powerful scene. And if I remember right, Will Smith's character said something like, it saved me because I had a higher chance of living. And he said, and any human would have saved the girl. Any human would have known that, and I think that was a powerful way to express that. Now, on a larger scale, and this goes to something you'd wanted to talk about, the idea of that movie, also the adversary in that movie, is trying to become a benign overlord because it thinks it can manage humanity better than we manage ourselves, which in the greater scheme of things is probably true. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I know that was an area you wanted to talk about as well.
Yes, I mean, again, it's a deep philosophical thing. Plato would discuss about the best way to organize a society is not to have kings, but to have philosopher kings, wise people. He was heavily criticized by Popper in the Open Society and its enemies, as that this is a tyrannical form. And philosophers are as human as anybody else and are as likely to be biased in their decisions as anybody else. And so he was dead against it. But if you had a philosopher king, let us say a benign AI, as an overlord of society, and it always made justified and decisions that were supported by the majority, then if it's supported by the majority, it's a proxy for democracy. Now, the thing is that how do you vote it out? Which is a fundamental requirement for democracy. So you have that problem. I think in the end, we have to make a decision to have super intelligence and high, beyond human level artificial intelligence as in the loop, but not the decider of the loop.
Yeah.
Because if you think back to the movie I, Robot at the very end, so we've talked about the beginning, talk about the end, when, what was the name of the robot protagonist? Sonny, I think it was, right?
Yeah.
So Sonny is saying to the central intelligence, and the central intelligence is saying, you know, I'm right. And I think Sonny says words to the effect of, you may think so, but it lacks heart, or it lacks,
lacks soul, right?
Lacks soul, like this. I forget the exact words, I'm sure your audience.
Well,
but that's part of the point. It's like, you can be very precise in saying this person should die for the benefit of society. In philosophy, it's part of what we call consequentialism. So what are the consequences of not killing a person? Even though, or throwing them out of the balloon, you may kill, a bunch of people who don't deserve to die. So the ends justify the means is the position. And the point is as humans, we never know what the ends of a series of decisions will be. The human planning very quickly morphs into the unknown, and consequences cannot be seen. But evil means can be seen. We know they are wrong. Killing people we know is wrong. And if we end up killing a person because we wanted a good end, but the good end doesn't appear, a bad end appears, we may trace it back to the evil ends, and there's no justification then. We can say we tried our best, but our acts led to ... So we have to be very careful about these things.
Yeah, and if I could interject for a moment, and this is something that kind of occurs to me. Now, this idea, again, in iRobot, this benign overlord, where they take over and they try and run things because they know it's better, that to me seems, obviously it's contrived, right? It's a plot device, but something that's far more likely, and I think it's happening today, is we are giving our power to AI because we just can't manage complexity. And when you look at like internet systems, or you look at like last mile telecom systems, the electrical grid, I mean, these systems, they're already too complex for people. They are becoming more complex and intertwined. We will reach a point soon where we probably have to hand these things to AI because we just can't manage it. That's my thought.
I came across the point a while back, listening to a video of Daniel Dennett talk about where we're going with AI. And one of his key points, and I think I remember the expression, is we should not cede moral authority to these systems that we do not yet fully understand. Well, we can't make them, but even in narrow areas, such as in killer drones operating autonomously, we shouldn't cede our moral authority because it's a slippery slope, a thin end of the wedge. We then get ourselves into a self-satisfying position where if something goes wrong, if the person was not a terrorist that you were targeting, but just somebody, a child holding a wooden gun or whatever, then you can't say it was the drone that made the decision and it's not me. Because somewhere in that loop, somebody did not do the diligence to check that these misidentified signal analysis would be a possibility. And as I say, since von Clausewitz, the idea of the fog of war has been known for a long, long time. And Yeah, I recommend people look at the movie The Eye in the Sky to really get a sense of some of the moral issues. So do not cede moral authority lightly, is my point. I mean, there are some people, just to take this to a really futuristic end. Have you heard of the concept of Rocco's basilisk?
No, can you explain that?
Okay, so it's an interesting conjecture that some people refer to as the most horrific conjecture in human history, something like this, which sounds ridiculous, but let me take you through it quickly. The idea is that AI in the future could be so incredibly super intelligent that it could theoretically develop retrocausality, time machine kind of interaction with the past, and which is not prohibited, by the way, from physics through either closed time-like curves or some quantum effects, and reaches back to reward those people that promote AI and to damage those people who wish to resist it. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay.
And the idea is that it's promoting itself into existence and stopping people, putting obstacles in their path to be able to deny it its overlordship. Now, that's an interesting conjecture. But it could just as easily, that's sort of like the demon in future superintelligence, if you will. There's the angel form of it as well, which is that you have the same circumstances, but is trying to enable mankind to fulfill their destiny, to be able to get beyond climate change, to be able to get beyond warlike mentality, and it will create tensions which get resolved and progress that gets resolved along a path, a teleological, meaning to say a purpose, towards a good end for humanity. So you have the demon and you have the angel, Rocco's obelisk argument. And the thing is that that's well into the future, but if we start to talk about benign overlordship of superintelligence, who knows what the rationalization is of such a system? It's difficult for us to say. My only suggestion is that we build, I think, take the risk to build artificial consciousness so that the system can develop an artificial conscience, a playing out of scenarios and evaluating them as ethical or not, so that it can develop this thing we call a moral compass of right and wrong. And then that moral compass can be generically applied, not just in narrow domains, but in domains and issues and scenarios that it's never encountered before. So it has no rule to tell it what to do. Has no training to give it a neural network determination of what to do. But it has a moral compass as to say, I don't want to do this because it's wrong. And if that's tuned to our better natures, not the monsters of our id, which we talked about in a previous discussion, then we have a chance that this benign overlord would do what is right for us. Let us come back to Asimov stories. In the Asimov stories, they're not just about the books that deal specifically with the robot consciousness or the robot activity. There is a series before, there's a series afterwards, and there's one of the protagonists, I think it's a robot called, well, one is called Giscard and one is called Daniel Oliver.
Yeah, and then he appears in some of the successor books for Foundation as well. at the end of the universe. And if I remember right, this was one of Asimov's final, or it may have been written by someone else as a follow-on, but they were saying that he had been there the whole time manipulating things.
That's right. I mean, I won't give us some spoilers away, but yeah, he has been. And at the end, he makes the decision to become human and die, to build a biological body as opposed to a perpetual, what's the expression, immortal robot, and to withdraw from humanity so that humanity can evolve to its own destiny. And it may be that in the long-term future, superintelligence, I mean, where I'm going is something called the ethic of reciprocity. Let me go through that because it will prepare my argument. The idea is you do unto others as you would have others do unto you. I mean, it's a doctrine that you'll find in most, if not all, I believe all actually, for the main religious traditions, and also in secular tradition. I mentioned Kant, do only that which you would have as a universal moral law. And this is, I think, embedded in most of our philosophical systems. Now, if you really understand, and I hope I have a fair understanding of it, what it implies is if you are in a strong position, you should nevertheless act kindly with people in the weaker position. Because there is a possibility that people who are stronger than you, you would wish them to treat you fairly as well. I mean, Rawls has this theory of justice, which I invite you to look up, but it's the ethic of reciprocity. So if you have a superintelligence that looks down on humans, then perhaps there is another superintelligence invented a million years earlier who would look down on this superintelligence. So when we look at ants in an ant colony, we shouldn't destroy them. We should be altruistic outside of our own species, but generally speaking, as much as we are able to, because we see the ethic of reciprocity. So the future, far future, if AI does become super intelligent, and if we do import it with the concepts of consciousness and conscience and a moral compass, I think it will discover, like all of our world systems and civilizations, the truth of the ethic of reciprocity, and will not seek to destroy, compartmentalize humanity within some limits.
Well,
and that actually means that it may withdraw from humanity. I mean, that was Asimov's conclusion, I think.
Yeah, and you know, if I could interject for a moment, this is one of the things that I've wondered about in morality tales, right? And these, like the Terminator series, these are retellings of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and they're warnings, they're moral and ethical warnings, you know. But there is an implicit assumption about what have we missed, and mankind's creations, you know, wanting revenge or you know, being flawed, I guess, along those lines. One of the things that I liked about Ray Kurzweil's approach, there were a couple, but one of the things that I liked about it was Kurzweil, in The Age of Spiritual Machines, he had said, what if AI is able to be more moral, more just, more perfect than humanity, right? And maybe that's kind of an Enlightenment ideal, but I liked the fact that he was able to spin that argument. And what's interesting was when I had talked to the fellow about the battlefield robots the other day, one of the things that he had suggested was it's not just a question of, can this make perfect decisions all the time? It's, can it make better decisions than a comparable person, right? Because people make mistakes too. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's true. We have to live in the reality that we make mistakes. because we do not have all of the information to predict perfectly. We neither have information. First of all, we don't have information of initial conditions, which is a mathematical requirement to make solid predictions about the future. But we don't have all of the correct theories about how things will flow consequentially, particularly when we have humans in the loop. And so it's a fact that the best thought out means may deliver the wrong end. But if that formula, if that algorithm gets it more right than an ethical panel would do after reflection on the consequences, you can say that perhaps it's better. But the thing that I'm concerned about is the issue of responsibility. There is, how do we punish, or is there any validity to the concept of punishing an AI for acting outside of its loop, outside of its envelope of decision making? Will we cede moral authority in such a way that we obviate our responsibility for the acts of this machine that we enabled and we deployed, and it wiped out an innocent village?
Yeah. Well, and to complicate things even further, I guess, what the other thing that Kurzweil had talked about was, if I recall, especially like uploading consciousness and things about like that, AI ethics and decision making on its own, I guess, in his model would be rather limited. I'm not expressing that right, because at some point we'll merge with AI. It will become us. But again, this goes back to this ghost in the machine, because if we do start to upload consciousness, if we do merge our collective or subjective, minds with AI, then it will absolutely take our biases. It will absolutely take our flawed nature as well as our better selves, right?
Oh, yes, I mean, I agree. If it chooses to absorb our worst, our beast natures, as opposed to our better natures, I mean, if it's this super intelligent conscious machine, it has a choice as to what it accepts from us and what it doesn't accept from us. It may say, this is not an ethical position, this aggressive domination, imperial kind of control, freak kind of human trait is not good. It may be good in these circumstances, but not in the wider circumstances. And so I'm not going to absorb this nature. I will absorb a different one. There was a book, well, actually, it relates to some of the work of Neuralink and some of the attestations of the vision of Elon Musk about symbiosis. It's a transhumanist concept that we will merge with AI. And I think Musk positioned it as a way of, well, if we are these cyborgs, we will not be overloaded by AI. It would be a counterbalance against this, because we would have human AI interaction. Well, yeah. The problem is that if you're merging with something which is very much stronger than you, what you get is the strong part making the decisions and the weak part atrophying until there's nothing of it left. It's like putting on an exoskeleton for physical strength. If it's doing all of the labor and all your muscles are doing is just giving a hint of movement, and then the exoskeleton amplifies that, then what happens to that human body and the muscles? They will atrophy until there's no human part left.
That goes back to Lawnmower Man. That was the
part. It's a long while ago, but you reminded me of that. You see, the thing is that there was a book written by Susan Schneider called The Suicide of the Mind. And just as you would have this atrophy in an exoskeleton merger symbiosis, you may have a prompt, topical word in current AI, that says, I wonder how quantum gravity works. And there you go. Oh, now I know quantum gravity. It'd be nice to learn jiu-jitsu, a little bit like Neo in the Matrix. Now I know there's no effort. There is no neural development in the brain. All that it is a question and give, spoon-fed relationship.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you'd mentioned that. I saw something online just the other day. They were talking about someone was trying to develop a pill for exercise, and they said, well, you could take this pill, and this would, physiologically, this would be the equivalent of muscle exercise, and the first thing that came into my mind, several other people said this as well, is there's discipline, right? What you're talking about. There's a mental discipline, there's a focus, there's a lot more to exercise than simply muscle reflex. And so in your example, if you can have this prompt and instantly learn jiu-jitsu, then you're bypassing the discipline and the mental focus and the growth that goes into that.
I mean, there'd be no neural network development, because what you would be having in the case of, I want to know quantum gravity, then you now have like, okay, I now have these equations, I can remember, but the neural network connections won't be there. Your mind will be atrophying whilst what you've got is just an access to the system. My vision of integration with AI is not so much symbiosis, which I think becomes parasitic at the level in which it's been talked about today, but is where you have a Socratic dialogue. Let me explain myself. So you give a prompt. I want to know about quantum gravity. So in your visual field, in your occipital region, and in your hearing faculties, you now hear this little Plato pop up, or hear and see. It's not augmented reality, it's a brain machine interface. And this little avatar, Socrates, says, I understand you want to learn about quantum gravity. Yes. Tell me what you know about quantum mechanics. Tell me what you know about gravity. Do you know the problems about the models and how they fail to integrate? In other words, he's asking you questions and you are responding, and he's saying, well, here's the problem with that. So why don't you think about this, and we'll have a chat tomorrow once you've thought about it. So over a period of time, it's teaching you, and you are building your neural plasticity to understand on your own the new theory of quantum gravity. Now, of course, it depends on where your beginnings are in terms of physics for that particular example, how long it will take, because you might have to go back to basic thermodynamics and classical mechanics to get to the end goal. But if you're already fairly familiar, then it might be 2 or 3 years, but then you really got it. And you have it. It's not that it was given to you, but you have developed the capacity to understand it and even develop from it. And that kind of constructive engagement with AI is what we should aspire to. We should look to AI as an augmentation, not as a replacement.
Yeah. Well, Martin, on that note, let me close for today. This has been an amazing opportunity to speak with you about ethics and again, the ghost in the machine, which is us. It's what we bring into AI. We've run through a lot of concepts. So thank you again, sir. Thank you again.
Just to finish off on what you said, don't kill the ghost.